A 1, a 2, a 1, 2, 3, 4.
Welcome to
Playing
God!
Where we world build.
And we play.
God, in case you were wondering. That's basically what world building is.
Alright, let's get right into it. First of all, when you're building a world, you need a world to build, right? So, to build a world, you need to build a world, correct?
I mean, I can't argue with that logic.
So anyways, what makes up a world physically is its geography.
We should introduce ourselves first.
No. So, the geography of a world is important to make sure your world is, grounded and it fits the theme that you're trying to put across in your world. So, there are many methods of, conjuring up a geography for your world. You can either just roll some dice onto a piece of paper and draw an outline of it. You can just
steal random elements from a map like he does.
Exactly. Or you can use
Tectonics.js, which actually uses AI to model really realistic continental drift and tectonic plates and that kind of stuff if you're into science.
Now, if you're not into this whole tectonic science stuff, then you don't have to, but this is a way to get a nice, realistic kind of looking map. But your map doesn't have to look realistic. That's the thing. You can make your map the shape of a heart if you want. You can do whatever you want with your world as long as it fits your theme and your purpose. And that's the big driving factor here behind world building. It's the theme of the world you're building and the purpose.
Yeah. I mean, you could also do something on a website like Incarnate, which I have a grudge against because it has a premium where all the good stuff is.
So anyways,
Incarnate, am I right? I know you feel the same way.
So we're going to have this running for a moment while we talk about some of the aspects of a geography. And an important thing to keep in mind is what's really helpful to be making a world is to know the rules before you break them. And I think Neel has a nice explanation about this.
You should know how something works before you decide to make it different. Okay, I can't think of an example.
But anyways, the point here is to really maximize your efficiency in world building, and to make it
make it consistent, make it make sense.
Which it doesn't have to, but if that's what you're going for, then it's good to know how our world works before you go about making your own world. I'm not saying to become, master of Earth, but I'm saying just to know how some things work so you can implement them into your world in a way that fits your theme and your purpose.
And before you change something, you should at least know how it works and how it fits into other things that you aren't changing. Because everything is a big connected system. Everything interacts with everything else.
So let's just pause the map right here where we have it.
It hasn't moved. We're recording a podcast.
Okay. So it's moved slightly, but the point is if you're really in a creative rut to be making a geography, this is a perfect way to kind of get you out of that rut. I guess I kind of like where this is right now, so let's save that.
And once you have your map, you can go to maptoglobe.com. Don't be alarmed if it doesn't load the first time. Let me just reload this. Don't be alarmed if it has some kind of 404 thing the first time. It happens. It's weird.
So maptoglobe.com. That's MAPTOGLOBE period com
/pound. So anyway, you can put in any image you want, and it'll stretch it over onto this sphere, so it'll be a good map. Oh, by the way,
that's a great way to boost your creativity. If it's not clicking if you like the features but they're not really clicking for you on the flat map, you can take it to the globular level, so to speak.
Oh, and by the way, it also has a feature so you can procedurally generate a map. And if you like it, do whatever. And if you don't, then you can like edit it or take some parts out. But they all look like this for some reason. AI's still got a ways to go.
So moving on, there's this free art software called Krita, which is available on Windows and Mac and Linux.
And Chrome, but who uses Chrome OS? Honestly.
I know a lot of people who do. So anyways, what's really good about this is it's like Photoshop, but it's free and has less brushes, as our wonderful Neel said. But I think what's good about this is that it's easy to use. I guess if you just gotta practice with it a couple times, it's easy to use and you can get the hang of it and you can really manipulate the world in here. It's more of like a drawing software, but you can still, draw arrows. There's layers you can edit, and there's
also text. So you can just do this.
Oh, they changed it. The placeholder text used to be lorem ipsum. Now it's just placeholder text.
Yeah, so sad. So you can just change the font and the sizing and stuff.
So let's take this world for instance.
So yeah.
Let's just look at the geography for a moment. So just considering from geography alone, let's delete that.
It was from take one. So vector, just delete the layer.
All right. So let's just consider this geography. Looking at the world from this perspective, at least, which is kind of like centric on this island, it's covered in a lot of foliage, I guess you could say.
So it's near the equator, and the climate should be pretty good here.
And even if you don't want to consider stuff like climate and stuff, a good way to look at it, if it's green, there's a lot of biodiversity, a lot of cool stuff here. So a lot of people are going to be wanting to go here.
Yeah.
And that can create stuff.
If there's desert, there's not going to be a lot of life.
Like over here, considering like this northwestern continent, there's probably not going to be a lot of life here. Or you can make it the other way around. Maybe a desert is like the hotspot of life. It's just whatever you want to do, but considering the Earth's rules, if we're just basing it off of that, we know there's probably not going to be a lot of life here, and there's going to be plenty of life here. But
ecosystems still do exist in the desert, although usually they're more optimized to save energy and stuff. And like camels are not the norm. They're really weird and aberrant for being large desert-dwelling animals.
And considering camels, let's start looking at some real-world inspirations to geography from our Earth. So let's pull up a map of the modern-day world, geographical map.
Earth map. It's a map of Earth.
So not even considering the countries, let's just open,
Yeah, like geographical map, not political map.
Over here, we've already got a lot of things we can look at and like hyper analyze. But one thing that I really like to do is just look around the map and see if there's anything that I find interesting. And whenever I find something interesting, I grab that and use that as a part of my map. So let's start off first here with the Strait of Gibraltar. This is one of my favorite
It's one true love.
Elements of Earth's geography right here. And I just like the idea of having two, different groups, different forces on opposite sides, and they're just right next to each other. There's just that bit of water separating them.
And consider how that affects the cultures and societies. North Africa has historically not dealt with these guys very much, except for the gold salt trade and stuff. North Africa has more in common with Europe and Asia because it's closer. They have these borders. They have this sea across which to trade. Whereas North Africa and Southern Africa are separated by desert.
And the Mediterranean is also a very, very interesting thing to look into. I also like kind of basing some of my worlds around the Mediterranean.
Well, a Mediterranean analog.
Well, yeah. But I don't know, it's just something, to me, the way I like it, is just having everyone really close, but still have that little natural barrier. But in other people, they might like, having some guys over here and some guys over here,
Across
so
the pond.
it's good. It's good to take some I guess, inferences from the real world and find what you like out of here. You know, I just showed you a couple of examples of what I like here, but it's important to look across the map of Earth to look for some inspirations too. Even if you don't find anything, it'll just get you thinking, at least.
You could also look at stuff that happened to the Earth throughout history, like Earth map through time or something. So there's a website for this, isn't there? I know it's there, but wait, there's an article on it. Open source project. Oh, this is the one. Oh, never mind, it's the source code. Yeah, let's just cut this bit out.
Okay, so anyways, you can also look at Earth from other periods of time. Just look at maps of anything too. We're not just saying you only have to look at Earth. You can look at a map of Middle Earth. You can look at a map of whatever, just as long as it interests you and it has some sort of
like
inspiration. It holds something to you and it makes it interesting for you.
Yeah, like there's an interesting setup that I used in one of my worlds. Like look at Earth during the later part of the Jurassic. You have Pangea was just beginning to break up, so you had a big southern continent, Gondwana, and a big northern continent, Laurasia. Or you could have something like Pangea, one supercontinent.
And that could make for some really interesting world building, because the only real natural barriers here could be like mountains and stuff like that.
Also, because the ocean is a moderator of temperature, and that's how cool winds happen. In the center of a supercontinent, there's, if you're following realistic climate rules, a huge, big honkin' desert. And the most biodiversity is around bodies of water. Like, I don't know, over here.
And that could make it really interesting for people not trading across the water, but just like by land traveling, you know? It just makes it a very different vibe, and it'll fit the theme and the purpose of your world differently. So considering what you want your theme, if you want like a dark, gritty world, or if you want magical unicorn like playtime,
Yeah.
it just depends on what you want and the purpose of your world too. Like, are you playing a D&D with it, or are you just making a world for the sake of making the world?
Or are you writing a book, or doing an audio story, or a comic, or what have you?
So whatever you're doing, it's good to keep in mind the purpose. So let's say D&D purposes, it might be good to have a map with more, I guess, just differences throughout the entire map. So just
Different
more
biomes for your characters to explore and kill things in.
But in a world, for a novel, for instance, you're probably going to want a more recurring tone throughout that. So you're probably going to want most of the world to be a little similar or very different depending on what you're doing. Like, if you're writing a book about like explorers, obviously you're gonna want the world to be very, very different from like region to region. But if you're writing a book that's mainly about like centering around the theme and not really the world is just the backdrop for you, then it's good to make the world more similar to each other, so you don't have to focus on that as much. Now, moving on to a recurring theme throughout this episode, know the rules before you break them. Let's touch on that again a little bit.
Like, as I said before, this is a quote from Biblaridian of Alien Biospheres and Conlang case study fame. Know the rules before you break the rules. It's a good rule of thumb, because like, if you're going to...
Rule of thumb.
Yeah, if you're gonna make something, even if it's less realistic, you should know why something is the way it is before you decide to deliberately change it.
And that helps you make your changes more informed.
Exactly.
So, let's move on to our next big segment. We're past geography now, and we're going to come into naming, which also kind of ties into languages. So, let's move into naming and languages.
Naming is cool, and so are languages, but people get lost a lot because names are hard.
And that's why we have fantasy name generators, ladies and gentlemen.
Woo! We're generating fantasy names. Or we should put some music behind this post.
So fantasynamegenerators.com is a really helpful tool to find you names for anything. So whether it be locations, places, people, and the great thing is you don't have to take the names exactly specifically. You can just grab the name and edit it and make it different and make it fit. And a key thing about naming things is that you don't want to be embarrassed about your name.
Yeah.
Just choose a name that sounds nice to you and use it. If people are like, "Oh, what kind of a dumb name is that?" Then
Joke's on them. They're the dumb ones.
basically, yeah.
Yeah.
So let's grab something from Fantasy Name Generator.
All right.
Now, if you guys remembered the geography segment, we touched on that little island in the center with
Okay.
all that diversity. So
Places.
that island's going to be a very interesting thing to work with, and we're going to come up with a place name here. So on the top, we have the subsection of places and locations.
So we can go to island names. Let me just do some tab cleaning up.
And scroll down, and we can generate any kind of names that we want.
English names, French names, Spanish
So
names.
we know that we're not going to be giving our island a French name because that's sacrilegious. So let's use English names and Spanish names exclusively. Our island, what do you think is going to be the vibe of the island? It's very diverse, so obviously lots of different people there, lots of different things there.
I feel like tropical.
Yes, it's near the equator, and if we're following the standard rules of like equators, it makes sense for this to be tropical.
So maybe something Spanish, or actually, it's interesting to put like some kind of meaning and then put it through a translator. Like
That's also a great way. So,
Yeah.
for instance, if you're familiar with Matthew Mercer, in his world of Wildemount, right?
yeah, well done.
Wildemount. He has a city in there which they all start in called Trossenwald, and that's literally just like a peaceful forest in German. So it's really easy to come up with cool sounding names by just translating something from your language into whatever language you think fits the vibe. So we're going something tropical,
So maybe a language from an actual tropical location.
such as
Let's pick something completely random. Quechua?
all right. Now, what do we want this island to be?
By the way, people who know how to pronounce that, please tell me.
So
Let's say like island.
a little too basic, we think. So
Yeah, but that's just a little taste of what. That's like a starter. So let's see, maybe
maybe look up many people. You know, there's many people here.
People.
Runakuna.
That's just people. Runakuna.
That sounds nice. You know,
Yeah.
I could get behind that. So we're just gonna grab that, and that really shows you how there's so many ways to name things. Another inspiration you can use for naming things is random stuff around your house. So for instance, you got like a bottle of Colgate, mouthwash. Colgate. Let's read it backwards. Etaglock. Cool. Now we got an island called Etaglock. You know.
Or maybe you could go with something really weird, like this says anti-gingivitis. So we can go Citivigna.
If you want
Try saying that one 3 times
If
fast.
you want an island, you can make an sound for it. But the key is to draw inspiration from whatever you want and be okay with what you have.
Yeah.
So, let's move on to how in the real world. First, let's obviously name the island Runakuna.
Yep. Let me find a good font and stuff. By the way, Krita has a text tool if you want to add text and stuff. Let me find something that looks interesting. Almost ancient and map-like. While also still being legible. And it's not going to be Comic
Go up,
Sans,
go up.
'cause that's the worst one.
I liked Engraver's MT.
Ooh, yeah. And then size, maybe 18.
Make it white.
Make it white. So you can see it against the ground. Save, close.
There you go. We got
Runakuna.
And, you know, it's not too important to leave all the labels I would used to get into like all of these like specific like little cities and regions, and I would have all this text on my map. A good way that I found is to make multiple copies of the map, whether they be on paper or digitally, and have like one map of the continent names, one map of the geographical region names, one map of like the political powers and the kingdoms and the countries and empires and stuff like that.
And the good thing about Krita is, like, you can have all these as separate layers. Like, let's say there are a couple different kingdoms on Runakuna. So, you could, like, divide the island up. Like, have this kingdom here, and then...
And remember, your
This one
kingdoms don't
here.
have to be just straight line divisions. If you look at something like Brunei, you know, your kingdom does not have to be all connected.
Yeah, like, look at Brunei. It's got, like, one part here. And
Let's
then-
let's open a map and we can look at it.
Yeah, but, like, that basic idea. Like, Brunei. Why am I making so many typos? I hate myself. Anyway,
So as you can see, the country is basically split into two pieces, and they don't have to be connected. Another thing you can look at is, I think Michigan.
yeah, Michigan. That's what I was gonna say. But then Michigan is a territory within a nation, so I guess it.
But the idea is that
Yeah.
you don't have to follow the specific like.
Ooh,
If you look
climate
at
map.
like Western U.S., it's all like blocky and perfectly like fitted. You don't have to follow that.
Yeah,
Nor
like-
do you have to make your borders super natural and all that, like following the rivers and the mountains. Some borders pass beyond the mountains, and some borders follow the mountains and the rivers. It really depends on your purpose and what kind of entity you're creating within
and
those
then
borders.
a lot of borders are really weird because of historical happenstance, like the U.S.-Canada border, which was supposed to be a straight line on the 49th parallel, but I mean, a lot of stuff, history happened. The maps at the time weren't that good, so it ended up actually being a really weird squiggle.
And now let's look at other ways you can name things, even super simple. So let's look at River Avon. You want to touch on that, Neil?
Yeah. In the British Isles, there are many rivers named Avon, because the word Avon means river. The Romans showed up, they were like, hey, what's this river called? And they just said, it's a river. It's like, the River Avon. It's the 10th one this week. I wonder why.
So basically, the point is that you can make your names really, really dumb in meaning, I guess, and it can still work. Like River Avon sounds cool, but it really just means river. The river
Or
that's
like-
called river, you know?
Or like the country of Chad in North Africa, which is it just means lake.
So it's because Chad, the country of Chad, in the center of it, or around the center, has a very big lake that's called a Chad. So the country's named after the Chad. Chad is named after the Chad inside of it. Lake Chad, Chad.
Yeah.
Lake. The country called Lake, named after the big lake in it.
Yeah.
Country called Chad is named after the big Chad in it. That's basically...
Also, you have like Canada, when colonists came from Europe and asked the indigenous folk, what is the name of this land? They just said, it's a village. Kanata. That is the name of this land.
Canada is what they said, basically, which
They just
means
said,
village.
it's a village.
So basically, we've got an entire country named Village.
Yeah.
So there's really a lot of funny things you could do here, and a lot of super hyper serious, sweaty world builder stuff you could do. But it's really important to take it your own way.
Oh yeah, like historical happenstance is also pretty interesting because colonists, a lot of the time, they asked the tribes they knew what the names of other tribes were, and you see, these tribes didn't like each other, so it's like, oh yeah, hey, who are those guys? Them? They're nasty looting cheaters. And then they go on to the next tribe. Hello, nasty looting cheaters.
Yeah, so there's a lot of funny things you can do here. But the important thing is that historical happenstance happens because there's something to create the history. And something creates the history because it is built that way, I guess. Let's move on to the next segment, biology, our
Aha.
least favorite high school subject.
Speak for yourself.
I am speaking for myself. Let's get some information about alien biospheres.
Ah, yes. Biblaridian, who I mentioned earlier, made a YouTube-based...
Biblaridian of Know the Rules Before You Break the Rules fame.
Made a project called Alien Biospheres, chronicling the evolution of life on a planet slightly smaller than Earth, with an atmosphere containing an impossible amount of hydrogen sulfide. Anyways, you can kind of see the progression just from the titles. Life evolves, diversifies in the oceans, crawls its way onto land, makes its own ecosystems. Then the climate gets drier, the forests recede, some animals go back into the water. Meanwhile, the climate gets even drier and distinct habitats like desert and tundra form, along with rainforests. Then the big continent splits into two. Animals diversify differently, same with islands. Organisms become increasingly social. And then the two continents merge back together, and it's an arms race for who's the best at living.
And I think what's really nice about this is that you can always take it in any way you want. You can just like plop a map and make up some fantasy elves, or you can really take it in this way and consider the scientific principles behind your world and why it functions in the way it does.
Yeah, like a good way to populate an alien planet is to come up with a body plan and then diversify on it. Like, look at tetrapods. Land-dwelling, four-limbed fish descendants that did indeed evolve. So, like, when vertebrates first came onto land, they looked something like this. But if you look at birds and bats and mice and crocs and giraffes and what have you, they all have about the same body plan. 2 eyes, 2 nostrils, a jaw, 4 legs, 5 toes, spine, tail, bilateral symmetry, that kind of thing. And while some creatures like whales and snakes lost 1 or 2 pairs of limbs, they still descend from creatures that had those pairs. So, like, let's say you have a hypothetical creature with, like, 6 legs, 4 eyes, and 3 jaws. And then you can have a bunch of different creatures derived out of that body plan. Like, you could have dragons and centaurs, but with weird looking faces. Or even, like, 6-flippered whales and stuff. But they'd all be descended back to that same little lizard or toad looking creature that had all the traits that the modern versions share.
And I think what's really interesting about making your own biologies for these creatures is that you can build the biology both off of like purpose and the theme, or you can go for more an more of an aesthetic build of your creatures. So maybe you can build them because you want them to look a certain way or function a certain way in how they work within your world building.
Or you could do a blend of both. Like, look at the creatures in James Cameron's Avatar. Like, look at the creatures in... Let me find the creatures. Okay. Wait. Avatar creatures. If I get, like, a platypus bear or something... Okay, good, I got the right avatar. Anyways, like, look at all these creatures. They have some things like weird telepathic tentacles and dangly bits and glowing lights and a strange desire to kill each other that overcomes fear of gunfire. But they still all seem to come from some shared body plan with 6 legs, 4 eyes, 2 jaws, a tail, that kind of thing.
So the key takeaway from this segment is that they're mainly, I guess, considering the approach of building biology for your creatures, the main two approaches is aesthetic and more of like realistic, but it's great to blend them or use one or the other, whichever makes you happy and whichever fits the theme and the tone of your world.
And not all the creatures have to be related or even evolve naturally. Like, you could have something like in Lord of the Rings where the god Eru Ilúvatar creates all life. Or, like, you could have all the regular animals that we know evolve normally, but dragons and giants are, like, mutated by background radiation or came from another dimension.
And the key here is to keep the tone and the theme of the world that you're trying to create consistent. So if you're trying to make like a very realistic alternate world kind of thing, then it's probably going to be useful to know the rules of biology, the basic rules of biology, and how they can play into your world and the realistic evolution of your creatures. Or if you're looking for more of an aesthetic appeal, for your tone, so it's maybe more of this mystical kind of fantasy kind of world, then you can build the creatures off of their the way you want them to look and function, and then build that background off of them. Or maybe just don't build that background at all, because sometimes you don't even need the history of your world.
Like, whether you're doing something realistic or not, it's better to have no explanation than a bad one, because at the very least you'll be preserving some kind of aura of mystery.
And considering Earth, we don't know everything about why the Earth functions this way or why everything works the way it does, but we can make assumptions, and that leads us to also have different viewpoints, right? So that makes an interesting story, device if you have different people believing different things about the way the world works.
Yeah, like, maybe... Like, even in the real world, even though we have a pretty good idea of the shape and size of the Earth, you still have a lot of differing viewpoints by people who reject basic logic. Like, you have the Flat Earth Society, who believe the Earth's a disk flying at infinite speeds through space, or there is evidence that the Nazi regime during World War II didn't exactly believe the Earth was a sphere, or actually no, they did. They just believed that we were on the inside surface and that the Earth was concave instead of convex.
And you could take any of these sort of ideas and play on them too. Like Terry Pratchett in his series Discworld plays on the flat Earth idea.
Except the flat Earth is on the back of a giant turtle held up by, like, how many elephants was it?
4.
4.
So let's move on to evolutionary history on Earth, which can give us an insight onto how to make a more realistic approach of creating biology in your world. Take the reins.
So, evolutionary history on Earth. Well, if you're doing a more rigorous speculative evolution project, you might want to do stuff on biochemistry. I am no expert in biochemistry, so I'm not going to poke the bear there. But there are some interesting biological features and stuff in evolutionary history that, even if you're not doing something realistic, you can find some pretty cool creatures and, like, adapt them or adapt parts of them. Like, for example, the pterosaur Hatzegopteryx, the size of a giraffe, yet still capable of flight, and the top predator of the island on which it lived, with a massive beefy skull and beak, and a body optimized for flying and soaring, more specifically. Like, this thing is not going to be fluttering around like a sparrow. When Hatzegopteryx takes off, it's to soar long distances. So, perhaps you could take inspiration from pterosaurs for, say, dragon. There are also some important things to consider in the way of biomechanics. A good resource for this would be Hert van Dijk's blog Forahan Biology and Allied Matters, in which he talks about his speculative world of Foraha, but also reviews other works of speculative biology and gives insight on biomechanics and like how thick an organism's legs might need to be depending on how many there are at a certain size, wing aspect ratio, considering gravity and the thickness of the atmosphere, the stability of different body plans depending on weight and size and gravity and that sort of thing.
Now, returning to the map of our world, we now have biology, we now have names, and we've now covered geography as well. Now, quickly before we move on to the next segment, let's create some biology for our world here. Specifically, let's focus on Runakuna, the island. What do you think? What kind of life? Let's make a hypothetical species. What kind of life do you think would dwell here, and why?
Closed. Give me a second. Was everything saved?
No worries. Just
But anyways, islands tend to have a really interesting evolutionary background because for millions of years they're isolated from the rest of the world. For millions of years they're isolated from the rest of the world, and the organisms on islands have really weird adaptations. Like, look at some of the more interesting island creatures like lemurs, a group of primitive primates that went extinct literally everywhere else. But they survived on Madagascar after it broke off from mainland Africa and diversified into all of this. For example, eyes, whose special skill is being able to flip you off with an extra long middle finger, which they actually use to wheedle insects out of crevices. Or sifakas, which kind of walk upright by jumping sideways.
And this shows you how much you can build off of just one species. You can come up with all these little quirks and traits that'll make it more interesting. So now, considering our geography, considering the name Runakuna, considering the biology, let's take maybe like a hypothetical like lemur species, since I think that's what we were just talking about.
Yeah, or maybe we could have like, maybe on this island it formed early enough and far away enough from big like mammals and stuff, so maybe it's just birds on this island.
Yeah, let's consider it in that scenario. So, Runakuna's mainly.
So, perhaps the ancestral colonist of this island was a seabird, like maybe something relatively unspecialized that can do a lot of things, like a gull. To the people who said that pigeons are flying rats, you're wrong. So perhaps a simple, unspecialized, gull-like bird lands in long ago Runakuna. Wait, what? Why are there 3 versions of this file? Perhaps on long ago Runakuna, a gull-like bird lands. Perhaps a bunch of them. Perhaps they use it as a nesting colony, or were blown from their usual migration path during a storm. Either way, they're now isolated from others of their kind. And they start doing their own thing here. After they get over inbreeding depression and are genetically stable and healthy again, they'll start speciating and specializing into different forms. Like, gulls are pretty carnivorous. They eat things like fish. So how long would it take for them to start chasing down lizards and other land-dwelling prey? Maybe from there, their legs will get longer, their beaks will acquire a distinct hook. Perhaps they'll grow larger and start flying less, since there are no other predators to threaten them. And perhaps they might end up in a situation similar to the Sariema, a long-legged running bird that can fly but doesn't very often. And this bird would feed on lizards and insects and such. And maybe the occasional fish.
And this just goes to show you how, from literally a gull, you just like created like the history of an entire island, basically like the biohistory of an entire island, just from some speculations.
Yeah.
So the word maybe is important. Maybe this happened. Maybe that happened. Keep those all in mind. Keep them in notes so you don't forget.
But you also need to have like justifications for this stuff.
Well, not really. You don't really always have to have justifications for why you have it, but it can be good for a more realistic world.
Yeah, exactly.
If your tone
That's what I
is a
meant.
realistic world, you're going to need justifications to make it a realistic world. If you're going for a fantasy mystical, like, more like fantasy mystical kind of world, then
Maybe
you're
they're-
not going to need justifications, or maybe you'll purposely avoid justifications for that very purpose.
Or
Now-
maybe you'll put like something like they were mutated by a mad wizard or something, which is fine in the context of a fantasy world, but makes a lot less sense if you're trying to do something more grounded and realistic.
Yeah. So now we have the biology of Runakuna. Now let's move on to culture. Now culture plays a very big role in your world, because typically, if you're going to be using your world for any like
Works or games.
anything other than making the world for the sake of the world, for using the world to elevate some other kind of creative work, you're gonna need culture.
If you have intelligent species on it.
So let's start with some information that we took away from the book Guns, Germs, and Steel.
By Jared Diamond.
Take it away, Neil.
Basically, Guns, Germs, and Steel is an overview of history asking why certain countries came to have power and certain others didn't. And it's not because the people on them have some kind of intrinsic superiority or inferiority. By the way, if you're racist, stop listening and go find something better to do, like die. Anyways, basically, a culture is heavily influenced by the environment it's in. For example, going back to the world maps, going back to a map of the world, you'll notice stuff. Anyway, like, think about how the environment affects the people in it, not just like what species are there to be domesticated, which, by the way, is why Europe was able to, along with Asia and Africa, were able to grow and become more prosperous, because they had a lot of different species of plants and animals to domesticate for food and mounts and meat and milk, which is really important.
Such as horses,
Cows,
for
pigs.
speaking just strictly for mounting, we got horses over here in the old world, which is like Europe, Asia, Africa. But in the Americas, we didn't have horses. We had like llamas, basically.
Like,
which are
look
very
at-
frail.
Yeah, look at a llama without hair. This is not going to support a person's weight.
And that greatly impacts the way that society in the Americas was able to flourish and thrive compared to society in the old world with more, I guess, resources to utilize.
Yeah.
And touching on cows too.
Cows provide milk, which is really important because it's power food, it's energy. It's made to turn you from a wee child
Wee
to
lad.
a big, strong adult. It has a lot of energy and all the nutrients you need to grow. And while humans, by default, like all mammals, aren't able to digest it after a certain point in their lives, about a third of the population, myself included, has a mutation that allows us to digest milk even as adults. Which really proved an edge over those societies' competitors, because they were able to have a readily available and really good source of energy, especially if you turn it into something more travel conducive, like cheese or yogurt, which doesn't spoil as easily and can be carried in a more convenient manner.
One with cheese rules the world.
That's the moral of today's story. If you take anything out of this,
Cheese.
yeah, cheese good.
And another driving thing about culture is that things start to form as byproducts, social constructs.
Like religion.
Like religion. Because people are forming these groups, they need to, have certain advantages. They might want more people to join their cause. They might want to have a reason, a justification for taking out another tribe.
They might want to have stories to explain why things are the way they are.
And find reason where they aren't able to find reason.
Yeah, and make sense of an uncertain world, which is really comforting for most people.
Which is where religion comes in.
Yeah, and even environment influences religion. Think about Abrahamic versus Dharmic religions. About over here, Abrahamic religions began in hot, dry desert where if you wanted something, you had to do it yourself, and there's a lot of hardship involved. So people started thinking about, why are we suffering? Why do we have to live like this? And the answer they came up with was because it's all part of God's plan, and if we follow the plan and if we're good people, then we'll find, after we die or in the future, some great kingdom where we'll be able to live without fear.
And that's really the driving factor that provided comfort to these people. And it also became a drive for people to do good, which really helps the society. So even someone higher up could say, hey, why don't we incentivize this in this sort of way, incentivize religious principles.
Like not murdering people and that kind of stuff.
And moving on.
And a different environment will produce different results. Think about in India, you have dry season, wet season, dry season, wet season over and over again, which leads to kind of a cyclical worldview, that everything repeats. The world rises out of the sea, people are good, they become less good over time, then the rains come and the world is flooded again, and the world rises out of the sea again, the cycle repeats billions of times, and then it all ends because it turns out that was just God breathing. And another breath comes out and it all happens all over again.
And the great thing is that just not even it doesn't even have to equate to religions that we have on Earth. When you're making your own religions for your world, you want it to fit the theme and the purpose. I keep on saying this over and over again, but it's very important. You might not even have religion in some cases. You might have more of a philosophy that everyone follows.
Yeah, think about something like Confucianism?
Yeah, I guess so.
Yeah, basically, people wrote down stuff about philosophy back in the day in China, and then, for generations after that, Confucian scholars interpreted the Confucian classics, and they had civil service exams for getting into government of are you living well? Are you a good person? If so, come work for the government. If not, get lost.
Yeah. And the point is that whether it be religion like we see it on Earth, or more of a philosophical viewpoint, or just another way entirely, like a cult, whatever it is, it generally incentivizes behavior that progresses the society. And that's the key takeaway.
Of course, this is the perspective of here where religion, any given religion, is or isn't true. I'd imagine the entire dynamic would be really different if we lived in a world where gods walked among us.
Yeah.
And interfered with stuff and burnt down atheists' homes personally and that kind of thing.
And speaking of gods walking among us,
that's kind of sus.
Okay, that's not what I was trying to say. But speaking of gods walking among us, there are some people that will place themselves into these positions in order to reign over the other people in their self-interest, in the form of government.
And government will naturally arise out of anarchy most of the time, there's always some kind of social structure, as small as the family unit or as big as something like the United Nations.
When considering medieval England, you had at the top you'd have the king, then you'd have the lords, the knights serving them, and then the peasants. And the different layers, while they were living in different luxuries and such, the top levels of the hierarchy obviously enjoyed more lavish lifestyles. They were still interconnected and they supported each other in this sort of positive feedback loop.
Yeah, and like there are also different types of hierarchies. Like on one end you have absolute monarchy and hereditary dictatorship, which is chaotic and violent at times, and you have one guy at the top calling all the shots, telling you what you can and can't do. And on the other end you have something where instead of having just one person with all the power, everyone has the power collectively, which would range from, on the more monarchical side, a constitutional monarchy like England with a prime minister and a parliament, all the way to the other end of like communism or even anarchy, where there's no power to be had.
Or you can even organize it in some other way that seems interesting to your world. Like maybe there's a biological implication to the hierarchies.
Yeah, like maybe you have a eusocial system of like a hive where there are different castes with different biological adaptations, like ants. You have a queen and male drones whose only purpose is to mate with the queen. And then among the females you have workers who are like general purpose, soldiers who are big and strong and protect the colony from threats, and the queen is just a big baby generator that makes the other castes.
And it's important to draw inspiration from anything really that inspires you. And moving on, let's talk a little bit about cosmology and how that kind of takes a play. Because when you look up into the skies and see the stars, it's something that's completely, typically, I guess, considering Earth's perspective, completely out of your reach, especially considering like an ancient civilization's perspective. So when you're building your world, you want to consider whether or not you want to have these things that are out of reach and not understandable and mystical, and they create this sense of like unknown in your world. Or if you want everything to be more grounded and known, everyone knows what this is, everyone knows what that is. There's not really any mystery to the world.
And you have to consider, like, what is your world a part of? Like, Earth is a planet with several other planets orbiting a star in a star cluster, in a galaxy cluster, in a group of galaxies, in a galaxy filament, in the observable universe, which is part of a bunch of stuff that we will never be able to see because by the time the light reaches our planet, everything will be dead. So you have to consider the structure of your universe if you want to be more grounded and if you want to be more consistent and have like hard...
A realist.
Yeah.
There's hard world building and there's soft world building.
Exactly.
Soft world building really focuses on the unknown and the kind of tonality and theme that creates, while the hard world building focuses on the known and what that can create.
So if you're going for more hard world building, then you're going to want to focus on, in the cosmology of your world, what is your world a part of? Like, is it a flat disk flying through space? Is it a planet orbiting a star? Is it some kind of mega structure built by a god?
One idea I had, you can really reach out on a limb here. Like, one idea I had is that the world is like a little like booger on the end of a nose hair in someone's nose. That's the entire world, and the breathing cycles really influence the way that world functions.
What do you mean, like Horton Hears a Who?
Yeah, essentially. So it's like inhale, exhale, and that really affects how the world functions, I guess. But it really, the key is that you can reach out on a limb and create anything you want based on anything you want. Like, even if it's a nose hair in someone's nose or like a fingernail. Really, your world can be anything you want it to be. And the point is that it fits your theme and your purpose. So you're probably not going to have a world in a nose hair and it's like dark and gothic. because that feels a little more, funny, satirical. So you're gonna want to make sure that it fits your theme, but don't feel bound to your theme. Your theme can always change. You don't have to sit down and say, all right, my theme is dark and gothic, and then you always have to follow that. If your inspiration takes you somewhere else, follow that inspiration.
Yeah, themes are something you can play fast and loose with in any scenario. So anyway, how are we going to apply this to the Runakuna world?
Well, let's consider we have all these birds, right?
Or like the cosmology of the larger planet.
Oh, I see what you mean. So are we looking for a globe, or what are you feeling today?
I feel like something more grounded, like a globe.
So let's consider this planet, which contains the island of Runakuna, is a globe, right? So
Yeah.
how does this globe function? Is it orbiting something, or is it just traveling in a straight line, or is it still and it never spins? There's all these different variations you can create, even from just using grounded principles that we have here on Earth.
I'm feeling more grounded. Maybe we can just leave it with the traditional cosmology we have.
Perfect, and that's just A-okay. You don't have to reinvent the wheel every time you're making your world.
Yeah, but sometimes when you actually think about a world like, oh wow, this is a planet in space orbiting a star. Huh, that's weird. It really makes you ask questions like in the world of Avatar: The Last Airbender. Really good world building, by the way. If you haven't watched it, I recommend checking it out. Find it somewhere. But anyway, it turns out that the world of Avatar, where people can telekinetically control the classical 4 elements by doing karate, is a planet orbiting a star in space just like ours. And that raised a lot of questions for me. Like, putting it into that context makes you think, what about other planets? Are there like alien firebenders? How does like chi and energy bending work in the context of the wider universe? So it really raised a lot of questions for me, and maybe not in a good way.
And zooming back into our world, let's consider Earth. We have, the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans who heavily influenced each other in culture. You don't have to create one unified culture, nor do you have to create every single culture super different, because there's always going to be that sort of cultural overlap, unless you're considering like natural barriers, of course. Like there's not much cultural overlap from, Mesoamerica to medieval Europe, right?
Yeah.
But generally speaking, you're going to have a lot of cultural overlap in a world where it's traversable from one place to the next.
So maybe come up with like a couple main like concepts and then like flesh them out a bit and have them mesh together where those regions connect.
Exactly. So let's move on to our final segment here, talking about the tone, the themes, and how to implement that into your world building. So the tone of your world is really how, in whatever work you're using, whether you're making your world for yourself or you're using it for a greater work of creative fiction or nonfiction or whatever, the tone of your world is how it makes you or whoever's experiencing this world, whether it's in a book or in a game, how it makes them feel. And that's really the tone of the world. If you have a dark and gritty world like bubonic plague Europe, considering that, it's gonna make whoever's experiencing that world not feel, I guess, good. It's gonna make that obviously dark and gritty sense, and it's gonna feel a little hopeless. But that's, it just depends on what you're trying to convey with your message.
And unless you're trying to do it on purpose, maybe if you're doing something dark and gritty, don't make it too dark and too gritty, or else it'll get too bleak and no one's gonna care.
But at the same time, if you're making something really, really like positive, like a beautiful world where everything is possible, it's always good to have a nice balance of both, and that really makes it immersive, your world.
Yeah.
So
like
have some dark aspects and have some light aspects. You can lean heavily towards one way or the other, but it's always good to have it a little balanced.
yeah, like not everything is gonna be horrible and grim and everyone's dying and it's dark and everyone's evil and no one's good.
Check out our sponsor, Grim Hollow.
It's not gonna be like that. This is not Warhammer.
Okay, but anyways, yeah.
And neither is it gonna be perfect and angelic and heavenly unless you've just died. And
Yeah, and then there's not gonna
to heaven.
the real driving power behind a story, when considering you're using this world for a story, is the conflict which is created between the darkness and the light. That really creates all that conflict. If everything is perfect, there's no conflict, and if everything is horrible, there's no conflict.
Or like there is constant conflict, but there's no reason to care because everyone's terrible.
Yeah. So if there's constant conflict, then basically the conflict isn't worth anything because it's constant.
And if everyone is evil, there's no one to root for, and there's nothing to care about.
And
Warhammer.
Conversely, if everything is good, there is no conflict, period. There's no one to care or not care about because everyone's good. And that brings us into theme, which is the general idea you want to convey in your world.
Like, maybe your theme is good and evil or war and peace or something nebulous like that.
So if you're focusing on a world about war and peace, maybe, then you're going to have maybe a geography that's really set to put groups or entities apart or clash them against each other. So like Strait of Gibraltar, you're going to have two major forces right across from each other.
Strait of Gibraltar without the desert in Africa, so you have a really different people coming from the south to meet the really different people from the north.
Exactly. And that can cause war and peace. If your theme is more about the smaller, smaller lives of individual people, you might want to focus maybe on a city or a couple cities and how the daily life of each, a member of each class, if you have those kind of class systems, or just the daily life of each individual.
And keep in mind that you don't have to focus on the whole entire planet and everything on it, and you can just focus on one town, and if you want to, you can build out of that. Where does the sewage go?
Public transport,
Public transport. Oh, what are the cities next to it? Oh, what's this district? Oh, what's this government?
Yeah, exactly. So
and build out.
Your world building can still be big, but be in a small scale, if you know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
You can really flesh out a city, or you can flesh out the entire planet. Sometimes I'll make a few cities on the tip of a peninsula, and that's my entire world. So you really don't have to focus on the whole thing if that's too much for you, or if you don't want to do that.
And I feel like for this project, we can just focus on the island of Runakuna.
Exactly. So for future maps using Runakuna, it could just literally be an island in the middle of the water. We don't know what's beyond the water because that's not really what we're building, right?
Yeah.
And that's how you use the themes and tone to properly world build. Thank you everyone for listening.
Yes, I'm Neel, he's Max.
I'm Max, he's Neel.
Spelled with 2 E's.
Spelled with M-A-X.
Because, anyone's gonna spell Max differently.
And have fun playing God. Thank you for listening, and bye.
Bye.